On one single day, England killed more of its own people than on any other day in its history. And it did not happen in some distant mythic age. It happened on the 29th of March 1461. Palm Sunday, under falling snow, while men prayed for mercy and then showed none. And if you think medieval battles were about honor and knights, this story will break that illusion completely. The place was Towton, a small village in Yorkshire, and by sunrise two English armies were already staring at each other across a frozen field, knowing that by nightfall tens of thousands of them would be dead or fleeing, and that there would be no forgiveness for the losers. The war that led them here was the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that had already torn England apart for years. And by 1461, it was no longer about ideals or reform, it was about survival, names, bloodlines, and who had the right to exist at all. On one side stood the House of Lancaster, loyal to King Henry VI, a king crowned in 1429, who was deeply pious, mentally fragile, and increasingly absent from power. On the other side stood the House of York, led by the 18-year-old Edward of March, who would soon become Edward IV, a man who believed that mercy had already cost England too much blood. The winter before Towton had been brutal. Chroniclers like the author of The Arrival of Edward IV describe England as exhausted, hungry, and angry. Just weeks earlier, in December 1460, the Duke of York, Edward's father, had been killed at Wakefield, his head placed on a spike at Micklegate Bar in York, crowned with a paper mock crown. That image mattered. It told everyone watching that this war was no longer restrained. It was personal. And then came the Battle of St. Albans in February 1461, where Lancastrian forces defeated the Yorkists and allowed their soldiers to loot towns on the road to London. That decision would cost them everything. London closed its gates. The city council refused Henry VI's entry. Edward marched south, and on the 4th of March 1461 he was proclaimed king in Westminster, not by coronation, but by force of support and fear. But a proclamation is not a victory. The Lancastrian army was still intact in the north. And so both sides marched toward Towton. Estimates vary, because medieval numbers always do, but sources like the Crowland Chronicle and later historians generally agree that around 50,000 to 60,000 men were present, an enormous number for medieval England. These were not just knights, they were farmers, tradesmen, retainers, men pulled from villages who knew that if their side lost, they might be hunted down later by name. The morning of the battle was chaos. Snow blew directly into the faces of the Lancastrians. The Yorkists, positioned with the wind behind them, opened the battle with arrows. Chroniclers describe how the snow hid the true distance, causing Lancastrian archers to fall short, while Yorkist arrows flew farther than expected. The ground quickly became littered with shafts, and then something terrifying happened. The Yorkists advanced just far enough to retrieve the Lancastrian arrows and fire them back. It was not cleverness alone, it was brutality learned through years of civil war. After the arrows came the real fighting. This was not a swift clash, it lasted for hours. Men pushed, slipped, fell. The snow turned to slush, the slush turned dark. Contemporary sources like the Chronicle of John Binet and later accounts agree that the fighting was so intense that fresh troops had to be fed into the line again and again just to keep it from breaking. There was no room to retreat. Behind both armies were rivers and steep banks. You either held your ground or you died. And here is where the battle becomes something more than violence. Orders were given on both sides that no quarter should be shown. This was not accidental. In a civil war, mercy creates future enemies. Nobles knew this, Edward knew this. The logic was simple and horrifying. If the enemy survives, the war never ends. If they die, it does. The slaughter intensified in the afternoon when the Duke of Norfolk arrived with fresh Yorkist troops. Lancastrian lines began to collapse, men turned to run. And this is when Towton became a massacre. Retreat was impossible. Many fled toward the River Cockbeck, swollen with meltwater. According to later chroniclers, bodies piled so thick that men crossed the stream on corpses. Archaeological evidence found in mass graves near Towton Hall supports the scale of violence. Skeletons show repeated head wounds, signs of execution, not just combat. These men were hunted down as they ran. This is where the myth of chivalry finally dies. By nightfall, the Lancastrian army was destroyed. Henry VI fled to Scotland with Queen Margaret of Anjou. Edward IV remained. The numbers of dead are impossible to know precisely, but even conservative estimates suggest over 20,000 killed in a single day. For comparison, that is a massive percentage of England's male population at the time. Parliament later passed Acts of Attainder against Lancastrian supporters, stripping families of land and titles. Shame followed death. Names were erased from records. Sons inherited guilt. Towton did not just kill men. It reordered society through fear. Edward IV ruled not because he was crowned, but because Towton made resistance unthinkable. And yet, here's the part most people miss: the battle did not bring peace. It brought silence, a silence built on terror. People learned what happened to those on the wrong side. Chroniclers stopped praising mercy. Loyalty became performative. Obedience became survival. And in that frozen field, England learned that civil war does not end with victory. It ends with exhaustion and memory. Towton was not just the bloodiest battle in English history. It was the moment England understood what happens when no one is allowed to lose. And that understanding would haunt the kingdom for generations. But the fear did not melt with the snow, it hardened. In the weeks after Towton, the violence moved off the field and into daily life, quieter but no less brutal. Edward IV was crowned formally in June 1461, and almost immediately Parliament passed sweeping Acts of Attainder against Lancastrian nobles, using law as a weapon sharper than any sword. These acts named men who were already dead and men who had fled, declaring them traitors retroactively, stripping their heirs of lands, titles, and legal identity. This mattered because in 15th century England land was not just wealth, it was memory. Lose the land, and your family vanished from the future. Chroniclers like the author of the Warkworth Chronicle note how quickly loyalties shifted, not because hearts changed, but because survival demanded it. People learned to read the wind. They learned to be seen supporting the winner. Silence became a skill. Even mourning was dangerous. Public grief for Lancastrian dead could be interpreted as disloyalty. There are no mass memorials for Towton from the period, and that absence speaks louder than stone. The dead were meant to be forgotten. Edward needed obedience, not remembrance. And yet the bodies did not disappear. Farmers plowing fields years later would still turn up bones. Local tradition preserved the horror even when official records did not. Towton became a place parents warned children about, not as a lesson in heroism, but as a reminder of what happens when order collapses. What makes Towton so disturbing is not only the scale of killing, but how rational it was within the logic of power. Edward IV did not issue proclamations calling for mass murder. He did not need to. The message was already understood. Towton had demonstrated the cost of resistance so completely that further explanation was unnecessary. Authority after Towton functioned through implication. You knew what had happened. You knew what could happen again. This is how control works after civil war. Not through constant violence, but through the memory of it. The law followed the battlefield like a shadow. Courts enforced loyalty. Sheriffs collected fines. Juries knew which verdicts were safe. The machinery of government resumed, but now it was fueled by fear. Even among the victors, there was no peace. Edward's allies watched one another closely. Power gained through slaughter is never secure. The very men who had helped Edward win Towton would later rebel against him, including Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the so-called Kingmaker. That rebellion would lead to Edward's brief deposition in 1470 and his restoration in 1471 after more bloodshed at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Towton had not ended the Wars of the Roses, it had escalated them. It set the standard. After Towton, mercy looked like weakness. Restraint looked like risk, and so each side learned the same lesson. Destroy your enemies completely, or they will return. Ordinary people were trapped inside this logic. They did not choose sides out of ideology. They chose out of geography, obligation, and fear. Muster rolls show men serving under whichever lord controlled their region at the time. Loyalty was enforced locally, through neighbors, through landlords, through the quiet threat of being named as suspect. This is why Towton matters beyond the battlefield. It shows how mass violence reshapes behavior long after the killing stops. England in the late 15th century did not become more brutal in appearance. It became more careful. People spoke less, they watched more. They learned which banners to hang and which names not to say aloud. Chroniclers wrote cautiously. Even memory was policed, and yet the trauma lingered. When Henry VII later seized the throne in 1485 after the Battle of Bosworth, ending the Wars of the Roses, he ruled a country already conditioned by Towton. His emphasis on bonds, recognizances, and financial penalties was not new cruelty. It was refinement. He understood that fear did not need fresh blood. It only needed reminders. Towton was the reminder everyone shared. A single day, a frozen field, a lesson written into the land itself. The bloodiest battle in English history did not just decide a crown. It taught a kingdom how fragile order really was, and how quickly neighbors could become executioners. And once that knowledge enters a society, it never fully leaves.